The air in the great sept of Baelor was thick with tension, the crowd silent as they awaited the fate of Eddard Stark. The North's proud lord knelt before the boy king, his hands trembling, his face worn with exhaustion. Joffrey Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, his smug smirk widening as he leaned forward, eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. "Your Grace." Ned's voice was hoarse, heavy with the weight of his decision. He looked at his daughters, Sansa, pale with fear, and Arya, hidden somewhere in the crowd, watching helplessly. His honor screamed at him to tell the truth, to expose the Lannisters' lies, but honor had cost him enough. The North needed him alive. His daughters needed him alive. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Ned took a deep breath and spoke the words that changed the course of Westerosi history. "I swear my fealty to you, King Joffrey," he said, bowing his head. "You are the true heir to the Iron Throne." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some gasped in disbelief, others whispered, and a few even sneered at the once proud warden of the Ayash. North kneeling before the boy, they all knew, was no true Baratheon. Joffrey, however, grinned like a child given a new toy. "You see," he said, turning to the court, "even the great Lord Stark knows his place." He rose from the throne, stepping down toward Ned. "And what shall we do with you now, Lord Stark? Shall we let you return to your cold lands? Or do you wish to serve in my court?" Ned kept his eyes lowered. He wanted nothing more than to go home, to see Winterfell again, to warn Robb, to embrace his family. But he knew the Lannisters would never let him leave freely. Cersei Lannister's voice cut through the silence. "Your Grace, perhaps it would be best to keep Lord Stark close. He has shown his loyalty, but trust must be earned. Perhaps a position within the court," Joffrey scoffed. "A position? He can have a position in the dungeons." The boy laughed at his own joke. The crowd chuckled uneasily, waiting for Joffrey's final decision. But Sansa, still kneeling before the throne, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "Please, Your Grace," she begged, her voice shaking. "My father has sworn loyalty to you. Please show him mercy." Joffrey frowned, clearly irritated that Sansa dared to speak out. But Cersei placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something into his ear. After a moment, Joffrey nodded. "Very well," he said, though he looked displeased. "Lord Stark will serve as my adviser, but he remains under my watch. One step out of line, and I will have his head." The decision was made. Ned was led away, not to the executioner's block, but to the Red Keep, where he would be watched like a prisoner in golden chains. The North would soon hear of his submission, and the world would change forever. Ned Stark sat in the dimly lit chamber given to him within the Red Keep. It was not a dungeon, but it felt no different. Guards stood outside his door at all hours, and he knew better than to assume he was free. The moment he had spoken his vow of loyalty to Joffrey, he had felt a piece of himself die. He had done what he thought was best for his daughters, but at what cost? His name, once a symbol of honor, would now be whispered with disappointment in the halls of Winterfell. He could already imagine the northern lords gritting their teeth, furious that their warden had bent the knee to the Lannisters. A knock came at the door. Sir Meryn Trant entered, without waiting for permission, his smug face making Ned's stomach churn. "The Queen Regent requests your presence," Meryn said. "Now!" Ned stood, his joints stiff. The wound on his leg still ached, a reminder of his last encounter with Jaime Lannister. He followed the Kingsguard down the halls of the castle he had once walked freely. Servants avoided looking at him, nobles whispered as he passed. He was no longer a guest, he was a pawn, trapped in a game he despised. Cersei waited in her chambers, her golden hair glowing in the candlelight. She dismissed the guards, then turned to face him with a knowing smile. "You surprise me, Lord Stark," she said. "I expected you to die for your honor. Instead, you chose the coward's path." Ned clenched his jaw. "I chose my family." Cersei poured herself a cup of wine. "And now you are mine to use as I please." She took a sip, studying him. "You will serve as an advisor to the king, but let me make one thing clear. You have no real power. You will do as you're told, or Sansa will suffer for your defiance." His fists tightened. He had no doubt she meant it. He had seen what Joffrey had done to Sansa already. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low. Cersei smiled. "Loyalty, Lord Stark. Convince your son to stand down." "Convince the North that Joffrey is their rightful king." Ned met her gaze with cold fury. "The North will never follow a Lannister." Cersei smirked. "Then perhaps I should send Sansa back to you one piece at a time." Ned's stomach turned. He had no choice. "I will write to Robb," he said finally. "But whether he listens is not in my control." Cersei's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Good. Now let us begin." Ned realized in that moment that he had not saved his family. He had only delayed their suffering. Ned sat at the heavy oak desk in his chamber, staring at the blank parchment before him. The candle flickered beside him, casting shadows across the cold stone walls. His hand hovered over the quill, but he hesitated. How could he possibly write the words that would betray everything the North stood for? But he had no choice. Cersei's warning echoed in his mind. Sansa's safety depended on his obedience. He dipped the quill into the ink and began to write. "To my son, Robb Stark, Warden of the North. The North must remain loyal to King Joffrey. War will only bring destruction to our people. Stand down, return your banners home, and swear fealty to the Iron Throne. Do not let your pride cloud your judgment. This is the only way to keep Winterfell and our people safe. Trust in my decision. Your father, Eddard Stark." The words burned as he wrote them. Every sentence was a dagger in his own heart. He had raised Robb to be honorable, to fight for what was right, and now he was asking his son to surrender. When he finished, he sealed the letter and called for the servant outside his door. "Take this to the Grand Maester," he said, handing over the letter. "It must be sent to Winterfell immediately." The servant bowed and left. Ned closed his eyes. He had done what was necessary, but would Robb obey? At Winterfell, Robb Stark sat in the great hall, surrounded by his bannermen. The hall was filled with tension as Lord Greatjon Umber slammed his fist on the table. "This is madness," he roared. "Lord Stark would never send such a letter." Robb read the letter over again, his hands trembling. His father's words were clear. Stand down, submit to Joffrey, return home. But something about it felt wrong. His father would never bow so easily. Maester Luwin stood by his side, his face grim. The seal is real, my lord. The handwriting is Lord Eddard's. The lords erupted into angry murmurs. If we obey, the Lannisters will see us as weak, Rose, Bolton said smoothly. They will march upon us when it pleases them. Robb clenched his jaw. His father had taught him that honour meant standing for what was right no matter the cost. And this? This was not right. If my father sent this letter, he said finally, it was not by choice. They forced his hand. Lady Mage Mormont nodded. Then what do we do, my lord? Robb exhaled. The decision was his now. His father was a prisoner, and Joffrey sat on the throne like a spoiled child playing at war. He rose to his feet. We march south. The hall erupted in cheers and war cries. The North would not kneel. The banners of House Stark, the direwolf sigil on a field of white, rippled in the cold northern wind as thousands of men rode south. Robb Stark led the army, his direwolf, grey wind pacing beside him, its piercing yellow eyes glowing in the dim morning light. The North had answered his call despite the letter from his father urging him to surrender. Robb had burned that letter. His father had been forced to write it. He was sure of it. The Lannisters were holding him hostage, using Sansa as leverage. But Robb would not kneel. He would not be a pawn in their game. He would bring his father home with steel and blood if necessary. The Great Jon rode beside him, grinning. We'll break those golden-haired bastards like twigs, my lord. The North will not be ruled by a boy king and his snake of a mother. Robb gave a firm nod, but inside he felt the crushing weight of leadership. His father had never wanted war. But war had come for them. Rose Bolton, riding at the rear, watched with cold, calculating eyes. "We should strike quickly," he said. "Send a message to Tywin Lannister that the North does not forget." Robb's jaw clenched. "We strike, but we do not become them." He thought of Joffrey, the way he had mocked his father at the Sept of Baelor. If he had his way, Robb would put his sword through the boy king himself. They would march to Riverrun first, to gain the support of his mother's family. Then they would turn toward the Lannisters. One way or another, they would free Eddard. Stark, Ned sat across from Cersei in the dimly lit chamber, the heavy scent of wine and burning candles filling the air. The Queen Regent was sipping from a golden goblet, her green eyes watching him like a cat observing a wounded mouse. "You look exhausted, Lord Stark," she said, tilting her head. "Troubled by something?" Ned met her gaze evenly. "I know my son," he said. "He will not submit." Cersei smirked. "Then he will die." Ned's fists clenched under the table. "If you harm him, the North will never stop fighting." Cersei leaned forward. "Let me tell you something about power, Lord Stark. It is not won through honor or noble intentions. It is won by those who seize it. You had your chance to rule beside Robert, and you wasted it." Ned shook his head. "If you think Joffrey will rule wisely, then you are a fool," Cersei laughed, taking another sip of wine. "Perhaps. But he is king, and you are his servant now." Ned exhaled slowly. He had been trying to find a way out of this web of lies, but he was trapped. If Robb was marching south, he had to find a way to protect him. "You may have me in chains," he said, "but you will never have the North." Cersei's smile faltered for a moment. "We shall see." In another world, Walder Frey would have betrayed the Starks at the infamous Red Wedding. But here, things played out differently. Robb Stark never married Talisa. He knew he could not afford to anger the Freys. His mother had warned him, alliances were everything, so when they reached the twins, Robb swallowed his pride and agreed to wed one of Walder Frey's daughters. The marriage was political, not romantic, but it was necessary. And because of that, the massacre at the twins never happened. Instead, Robb marched south with the Freys at his back. The war had truly begun. Months passed. The North and its allies cut through the Lannister forces with relentless fury. Riverrun stood strong. The Vale, led by an unpredictable Littlefinger, watched from the sidelines. And in the distant east, a queen with dragons was beginning to rise. But it was Robb who reached the gates of King's Landing first. The city burned. The Lannisters were losing their grip. And inside the Red Keep, Joffrey raged, throwing tantrums, as his kingdom collapsed around him. Ned Stark stood in his chamber, hearing the distant sounds of battle. He knew his son had come for him. Cersei entered, her face paler than usual. "It seems your boy is not as foolish as I thought," Ned said. Nothing. He only waited. The doors burst open, and standing there, covered in dirt and blood, was Robb Stark. The war was over. The North had won. When the dust settled, Joffrey was dead, killed in the chaos. Tywin had fallen, betrayed by his own men, and the Iron Throne sat empty. Robb had no interest in ruling the Seven Kingdoms. He returned to Winterfell, bringing his father home. The North declared its independence, and this time no one could challenge it. Eddard Stark, the man who had once bent the knee to save his family, now ruled as the king in the North beside his son and the South. It could burn. The North would never kneel again.